Hello everyone! Today I'm going to talk you through freezing and why freezing might be the last straw to pull if you're trying to create great sounding music, especially on a really cheap machine that doesn't have a lot of CPU power or RAM to work with, and you would still be able to create awesome sounding and instrument-rich music with the help of freezing. So before actually getting into freezing, here are a few things that you need to remember. And you might have already experienced this. So if you start working with music, you will soon find out that the more instruments and the more effects and the more tracks you load in your project, you will also increase the load on your CPU, your RAM, your entire overall machine. If you're working on a small laptop which runs on outdated hardware and is over 10 years old, you might really quickly notice that the fans are turning up and your machine starts to slow down because of the heavy load of the DAW and all the instruments and tracks and everything running inside of it. Now, one of Reaper's most interesting and important features is that it itself doesn't require a lot of CPU and RAM power. Compared to other DAWs like Logic or Pro Tools, you name it, Reaper is one of the most power-saving DAWs out there. Reaper, as powerful as it is, you can compose and score entire films and movies with it, doesn't require a lot of power on its own. I'm pretty sure to say that you can run Reaper on every machine that is out there, even the older ones, at least on its own. When it comes to actually creating music in it, Reaper can't do a lot about the requirements of the different plugins and instruments you're trying to use, but it can help you take away some pressure from your older hardware as best as it can. And it does that by freezing audio material. Freezing isn't a feature that is just related to Reaper. Every major DAW supports freezing, and in every major DAW, freezing works in a kind of similar way. So that's why this video might be interesting for you, even if you're not a Reaper user. In general, every plugin, every effect, every instrument, everything that you load onto a track, even if it's just audio data, will consume a tiny bit of CPU or RAM on your machine. Sampled instruments, so for example orchestral instruments, a violin or a trumpet or things like that, require more RAM than actual CPU usage, because they were recorded, and now the only thing that your CPU needs to do is put all the samples together in the way that the MIDI tells them to. Synthesized instruments, however, require less RAM but more CPU usage because the sounds get synthesized in real time. A more modern approach are sample modeled instruments, which are generated on CPU and partially recorded in samples. But no matter which instruments you use, you might actually end up in a situation where your DAW starts to stutter and your sounds just don't sound right anymore, because either your RAM or your CPU usage is at its limits and your computer just can't hold up anymore. And that goes for Mac as well as Windows. But hold your horses, you don't need to buy a new machine just to fix that. There is a way around that, although it will require a little more effort than if you had a machine that could just carry and handle all these things on its own. But you don't need to do this, you can just freeze here. So what does freezing do? Freezing will basically just render out the tracks that you've selected into an audio file, remove the real-time instruments and effects from the track, and replace it with the rendered out audio instead. While even an audio item will consume a tiny bit of CPU power and RAM, that is far less than the actual consumption of the plugins and effects on the track. So that is why freezing actually helps. In Reaper, there's a freezing function built into Reaper already. That freezing function will quickly allow you to just select tracks and freeze them either to mono or stereo tracks, depending on your selection. I've got a project open here. That is one of the Theme of the Month challenge videos I did last year, and it's the Magna Carta one from, I think, the 14th of June or something like that, and it sounds like this. Now, this is just instruments right now, so nothing is frozen here, but everything real-time instruments. Right now, and I can check my resources with an NVDA add-on, my resources look like this.
23.4% RAM used, CPU at 2.2%.
Now, these are all sampled instruments, so they don't take up a lot of CPU power, but they take up some RAM, and I'm at 64 gigs of RAM right now, so 23%. That's roughly about 16 gigabytes used. Now, I want to cut down on this and reduce it as best as possible. I want to freeze here, so I select all the tracks by pressing Ctrl A.
5 tracks selected.
And I open the actions list.
Actions dialog filter.
And I type in freeze, F-R-E-E-Z-E.
Z-E.
And now we use the down arrow.
List 1 list, description, track, freeze to mono, render pre-fader, save/remove items and online effects.
This is the mono version.
Description, track, freeze to multi-channel, render pre-fader, save/remove items and online effects.
That is the multi-track version.
Description, track, freeze to stereo, render pre-fader, save/remove items and online effects.
That's stereo.
Description, track, unfreeze tracks, restore previously saved items and effects.
That is unfreeze.
Description, view, show track freeze details.
And that is the details version. Let's just pick stereo here.
Description, track, freeze to stereo, render pre-fader, save/remove items and online effects.
And press enter.
Rendering the file, dialog flag 24-bit 44,100 Hz 2ch, 5 files. App building not modified.
Now, that took some time because it needs to render things out, but now we're here and it still sounds like this. So my track still plays, but now it's audio throughout the entire piece instead of individual instruments and plugins. And now my resource usage looks like this.
21.6% RAM used, CPU at 2%.
So I roughly cut down by 2% of RAM usage. Now, this is a really tiny project, but I've got projects which basically have over 60, 70, 80% of my RAM in use, and if I freeze all of those tracks, it will go down to whopping 20% or something like that. So that can really save you a lot of trouble. But what are the limitations of this process? Well, if we select one of those tracks now,
one arm, one item,
and we check the item on this track,
1.01 MIDI freeze.
Now, this is a locked 0.1 MIDI freeze. So that means that it's locked. You cannot edit it. You cannot cut things away. You cannot change the MIDI anymore. It's now pure audio. So if you wanted to actually go back and change the basic MIDI and what the instruments plays before the freeze actually happened, you would have to unfreeze the track. Because right now, if we now select the track,
one arm, one item,
and we hit F to go into the FX list,
search filter combo box collapsed, edit blank,
we don't find any effect in here anymore because we've just frozen the track and we thus removed all the effects from this track and just rendered it out as an audio item. However, Reaper allows us to unfreeze as well. Unfreezing will just get rid of the audio item and restore everything as it was before we actually froze the track. So that is done by pressing Ctrl A again,
5 tracks selected,
and pressing F4,
actions,
and typing unfreeze,
UNFREEZ,
and selecting the corresponding action. And after waiting a little while, our project will be restored to the point where we've got several MIDI items, as we can see here.
101 MIDI.
And this is now MIDI, and I could edit it if I wanted to, and I can just play it back. So we are back in MIDI land, and we can now start to change things again. And as soon as we are done with the MIDI and we're happy with the results, we can just freeze it again and we'd be back in audio land and thus save a lot of resources. The items that come out when freezing in Reaper are locked, but that means that you can unlock them and mess them up big time. So I'd always recommend you to make sure to not touch them, because if you touch them, for example, you cut things away, you split things apart, you remove entire pieces of the items, you will not be able to unfreeze them properly. Reaper will most likely encounter an issue and will not allow you to go back. With the undo history, however, you will always be able to go back, but please keep in mind that you will lose the changes that you did to the frozen items in the process as well. Here's a tiny issue though. If you're working with more complex projects and you're starting to use track folders to organize your projects, for example, into sections like in orchestral pieces, strings, brass, and woodwinds, and things like that, Reaper will do the following when freezing those folders. Reaper will, instead of freezing every track individually, for example, the flute, the piano, the violin, the double basses, and everything, it would just freeze the entire folder track as one track, and then get rid of every individual subtrack, but only keep the folder track around. That might not be exactly what you want to have. Most of the time you want to have additional effects on the different instruments and stuff, and you don't want them to be frozen in one individual track, but have them on individual tracks so that you can mess them up and work with them individually. And I actually wrote a script to do that, which is called InteeliFreeze, and it can be found on my Repack repository, which I will link to in the video description. Just insert the link into Repack, open it up, and search for InteeliFreeze, which is written like intelligent and freeze. INTELLI and freeze. And I would just select all the tracks here.
5 tracks selected.
Open my actions list.
Actions.
And type in freeze again.
FREEZ.
And now we will have my actions come up too.
List 1 list.
And they are more or less identically named to the originals from Reaper.
Description. Script. Timtom InteeliFreeze freeze all selected tracks to mono recursively. Lure 1 of 9.
That's the first one.
Description. Script. Timtom InteeliFreeze freeze all selected tracks to multi-channel recursively. Lure 2 of 9.
Great.
Description. Script. Timtom InteeliFreeze freeze all selected tracks to stereo recursively. Lure 3 of 9.
Yep.
Description. Script. Timtom InteeliFreeze unfreeze all selected tracks recursively. Lure 4 of 9.
Okay. Now, InteeliFreeze will do basically the same thing as the usual action from Reaper, except that it skips tracks which don't require freezing at all. So we'll look if you've actually got effects instantiated, if you've got instruments instantiated which require freezing, in which case they will freeze them, otherwise it will just skip them. It will also don't freeze into folder tracks, but freeze all the sub-tracks individually, which might be useful. As I said, the scripts are within my Repack repository. There are a lot more useful scripts in there. If you don't know what Repack is and how you install it, I've already created a video on that kind of topic, together with how you use scripts from Repack to actually use the RS5K Resymplomatic 5000 sampler within Reaper more efficiently to create your own drum samples. And I will link to the video in the video description and in the info card, just so that you know how to get started with Repack. One last thing to add here, I would always recommend freezing a track before actually putting it aside because you're finished with it. Most people like to come back to older projects in the future just to have a kind of reference how you did specific things, or you just remember the piece and you want to listen back to it again. And sometimes instruments change over the course of the years. Sometimes they receive updates and they will stop to work, or you uninstalled instruments because you moved your PC or computer 2 times in the last 10 to 20 years. And now you try to open up a project and you just find out that you're missing an instrument and everything doesn't sound the way you would expect it to sound anymore. Freezing can solve that issue, because freezing will render everything out to audio before actually putting it away. And as soon as you load it up again, it will all be audio and thus sound the exact same way that it was before. And you can always go back and unfreeze to try to reconstruct the way it was before freezing it. So if you still have the instrument, it will successfully unfreeze, give you back all the MIDI items and all the effects and everything, and you can just make tiny adjustments, freeze again, and just release a remastered version of your piece. If you, however, don't have the instrument flying around anymore, it will greet you with an error on telling you which instrument's missing, and you can try fix the issue so that you can continue working on your piece. And even if you can't, you will always have a version of your piece that is still working because you actually froze it into audio stems, and you would be able to play it back and process them and whatever you want without running into the issue of not having a dedicated plugin or instrument or whatever anymore. That's it. That's more or less all about freezing and how you do it. I hope this proves useful, especially if you're running on a tight budget and you cannot afford a really expensive and powerful machine. If you've got any question about freezing, let me know in the comment section below the video. If you found this video useful, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and until next week, bye bye.